Digitization streamlines processes, boosts productivity, reduces paper waste, saves countless trees, cuts down deforestation. These are just some advantages of digitization. However, digitization relies on servers that are hosted on physical data centers or cloud-based data centers. These servers consume vast amounts of energy and contribute to carbon emissions. Let's hear from Andri Johnston, a digital sustainability lead at Cambridge University Press and Assessment, on how her organization assesses the digital carbon footprint of their digital products and activities.
Digital sustainability and what we do at Cambridge University Press when we say we're working on digital sustainability. I think it's just important to kind of start off with highlighting what, as a business, as Cambridge University Press and Assessment, what our commitment is around environment. So we have a commitment to be carbon zero on our energy-related emissions by 2048, which aligns with the University of Cambridge. But we've also got an interim goal to reduce this by 72% by 2030. When we talk about digital sustainability, we talk about it as a concept of understanding and minimizing the impact of digital products on the environment. It's really important that we don't just report on our emissions, but we also actively start to improve them. That's where a lot of innovation comes in. So to set the scene on why it's important that we look at digital emissions, it's a very new field under scrutiny and under investigation in the sustainability sphere. But new research has come out saying that the ICT sector, so the Internet, Computers and Things sector, is responsible for 1.4% of all global carbon emissions. However, what is more shocking, and I think something that the industry is starting to focus on more, is that the ICT sector consumes 4% of global electricity. The majority of this is consumed by data centers. And obviously, some of this is created via green energy, but still the amount that's being consumed is very, very high. And we have the opportunity to make our products more efficient to lower this consumption. For us in the business, we have a term defined as a carbon benefit. And that is when we change the way that we're working to reduce emissions in a certain area of the business. So for example, there is a very big carbon benefit to shifting from print to digital in our books, our exams, our textbooks, and our journals, because we're lowering the emissions from printing, distribution, warehousing, etc. However, we need to keep in mind that there are always digital emissions. There will always still be emissions from our digital products, and that these will most likely continue to rise as we get more customers, as we publish more online. So it's really important that we start to think now about how we can implement ways to minimize these impacts. So how do we start to calculate digital emissions? And this is where it becomes really interesting. Well, digital emissions calculations made up of 3 different parts. These are the areas that we collect data in. The first part is around our cloud hosting. So that could be with AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. And basically, we need to estimate the emissions that we produce by having our content hosted with them. To do this, we currently use billing information, and I'll touch on that in a moment. The second area that we collect data from is networking. So this is the internet connection that's being used to access our content online, and split between cellular connections and fixed line connections. This is a very, very hard area to actually collect data about because most of our tools, our analytics tools, don't pick this up. The only way you can really get this information is through things like surveys. So for the most part, we use proxy data. The current proxy data is skewed slightly towards Europe, which means that if you have a lot of customers like us outside of Europe, it's not always 100% accurate. So that's definitely an area that needs a bit more investigation, I believe. And then the last area that we collect data from is our end users. And this is where we use tools like Google Analytics. That's the most common tool that's used, but other analytics tools can be used. We look at the content that's being consumed, where customers are accessing it from, how long they're spending on the pages, um, uh, the device they're using, and then also the page weight, so how big the pages are. So to do this calculation, we have a project called the DIMPACT project, which uses a tool called DIMPACT. And this tool was created by the University of Bristol and Cornerstone, a consultancy company here in London. And the tool helps us to take the data that we collect from these 3 different areas, input it into the tool, and provide us with carbon emissions output. For us, though, it's really important that we don't just report, but that we also understand the real world impact. So that's the other side of innovation that comes in when we talk about digital sustainability. So what goes into the DIMPACT tool? Well, it's a magnitude of data that we collect from all different sources. At the end of what we need to input data in an energy related format, so in kilowatts an hour for the most part, except for our end user devices, which obviously it's about how long people spend and page weights. But this is tricky because I mentioned from AWS, we get billing information, and we need to pull information about location of servers, how much hosting we have with them, CPU speeds, all these things we have to pull from the bills, transform the data into kilowatts an hour, and then input it into the tool. So it's quite a complex process. We're really lucky. We have some great data analysts that work with us, and they've been able to create scripts to do this based on methodology that from a company called, or a nonprofit called Cloud Carbon Footprint. We've also kind of adjusted the various methodologies around page weight calculations and then also cloud hosting ourselves. So we're busy creating our own version of the methodology and using these scripts that our data analyst has created. So there's quite a lot of continued investigation that we need to do and continued updating of how we're transforming the data. To give you a bit of an overview of how exactly this is possible, the DIMPACT tool is mapped to the publishing workflow. So this is a very in-depth, complicated version of a traditional publishing workflow. And the various colors then relate to these 3 there is a third category called third-party services, but we don't really include that because we can't collect the data. But the various colors relate to specifically these areas where we collect the data from. The DIMPACT tool also has other modules and work with other companies, like, for example, the BBC and Netflix. So they have a streaming module as well, where it would be very similar to this. The same 3 areas of data collection is mapped to the workflow for streaming, for example. So this is just a very a simpler view of the workflow. So everything in purple would be your hosting, your networking would be red, and everything in yellow would be your end user devices. This is just a snapshot of what the tool looks like. So it's a very simple user interface, and you have these drop downs, and you add the, as I said, kilowatt an hour data that we've transformed into these boxes. You can add some notes in there, and once you're ready, you run this and you get your output as a carbon emissions number. So it's continuously being updated and changed. I wanted to highlight as well that this same principle can be applied to things like online events. A couple of years ago, we applied the DIMPACT principle along with the University of Bristol and the DIMPACT team to calculate the carbon emissions of an online conference that we had. So it's just to show that calculating the digital emissions isn't limited to, books or specific products. It's the same methodology, the same three areas. Is that you look at your hosting, your networking, and your end users information, and you can apply that methodology to any digital product, which is, I think, quite unique compared to physical emissions, where it's the workflows are a lot harder to map. So what is the real world impact? As I said, we have started to understand what the carbon emissions are, and obviously we have great tool that helps us do that. But we also need to understand how we can start improving our carbon emissions. So again, this is academic as an example. As we saw, the emissions had started going up, and one of the big reasons was because the page weight had started going up. And what we are now able to do, because of the initial investigation that we do and the initial data that we collect before transformation to input it into the tool, we're able to identify areas on our pages, on our web pages, that are impacting our page weight and making them really big. I just kind of added this in here because I think it's really important when we start to think about um, this real world impact, that everything that we add to a digital product, like a web page, a journal, an app, a textbook, or online textbook, everything gets stored in the cloud. And the cloud obviously is in the cloud. It's a bunch of servers. So yes, these servers are pretty efficient, but to keep them efficient, the stacks need to be replaced quite often. So there's definitely an extra waste component to keeping the servers very efficient, but also a lot of resource in terms of energy is used to power them and also keep them cool. So water usage and energy usage. Some data centers are powered by green energy, but not all. It's not yet the norm. Something to also point out is that a lot of data centers use energy from specific countries. I mentioned the electricity usage that the ICT industry consumes. And for example, data centers in Ireland, which is the biggest, the country with the largest amount of data centers, data centers use about 20% of the country's electricity, which is something that we need to start considering as well when we think about it. But luckily, there are things we can do when we think about the cloud, how we can shape and do the architecture for our products. But also, when we start to understand that the cloud isn't a cloud, that's a physical place, we start to think differently about our products. It's also quite important that we remember that different countries, and so our different customers in those countries, have different energy grids, and different energy grids emit different amounts of carbon emissions. This isn't a case of, you know, in the north, in the global north, everything is green, and everywhere else it's not. As you can see, the US, there are certain states that are green, there are other that are not. So this is a great example. The green bits are obviously the countries that have quite a green energy grid, and the darker the color, the less green energy is in those countries. So Australia is a very good example as well, where because there's different laws across different provinces, you get this breakdown. But then Brazil, for example, they have a lot of green energy because of just the decisions that were made by the government there. So using the kind of answer that greens will greenify is not good enough for us when we think about creating our digital products, because our customers are so diverse in terms of where they're located. It's also just something to keep in mind when we think about our data centers as well, because they could be in these different locations where different energy grids are used. So all of this in mind, and understanding that our page weight has gone up, what can we start doing? So we at Cambridge University Person Assessment, and when I started in this new role as digital sustainability lead, we started thinking about how can we start supporting our product teams to improve our products. And we came up with a simple set of principles and guidelines. Basically thinking about our product life cycle and something that we can add into our product life cycle throughout. Thinking about assessing, so measuring our emissions using things like the impact tool. Thinking about setting targets. So if we know what our page weight is, can we start setting a target to say we're not going to go above X amount? And then how do we start improving? And then we start the whole process over again, and we measure and set more targets, and etc. And from this, we put together a set of digital sustainability guidelines based around three principles: sustainable design thinking, carbon-aware design, and inclusive design. And each of these kind of relates to a different part of our product development life cycle and our teams. So if we think about sustainable design thinking, we're thinking about support for our product owners, our support for our UX teams, any content creators, for example, and our developers. So thinking about page weights, thinking about design, how do we design our products to make them efficient? What media are we adding? When we think about carbon aware design, that's where it becomes a little bit more technical. We think about the cloud, we think about how to be carbon efficient, energy efficient, we think about security, that kind of thing. And inclusive design is where things like accessibility get pulled in, because an accessible product is a sustainable product. And we also think about global usage design. Something that we need to keep in mind as well from a social side when we think about digital sustainability is that in a lot of areas where the grids have high carbon emissions, these are also countries or areas in the world where data costs are very high. If the majority of your customers or a large proportion of your customers sit in these areas, we cannot create products that have a high page weight, and that means that they can't even load our product. Why? What's the use? For us as a business, we're an education institution. Our whole aim is to bring education to the world. So it doesn't help we add so much to our page that we make it so big that it can't be loaded, because the data availability, and the data costs are so high. So we think about inclusion as part of our design as well. Interesting training that I did a couple of weeks ago with product managers was, when we start to think about this, start to think about the planet almost as a persona, like how the entirety of the planet, not just individual people. And I thought I'd just end off with a few examples of where this has been done already. So this is a magazine, online magazine about sustainable internet and sustainable technology, and it's hosted by a server that is powered by green energy. Um, and they've both applied the notion of thinking about the energy grid here, but they've also applied kind of empowering their customers or their users to think about their impact. Because if the energy grid is low, if there's less green energy, you will automatically only see the text. You have the power to click over here and see the full color version like this, but it's starting to make the customers or the users aware. So I think it's a very smart way of kind of showing what the impact is just because of energy usage. More and more templates web templates are starting to use these principles around color. Green, for example, is a very good color for energy usage, and things like simplified images, the correct format, etc. And other companies have low their normal websites, but they also have low impact websites to start to show customers what the impact is of having certain things on their website. This is an example not of a technology, but it's a burger company called Brewdog. They make beer and burgers, and they actually have the carbon emissions of their individual foods on their menus. And it's an interesting way of thinking about, again, making your customers aware. Is this potentially something that we can do? Some companies or smaller websites are showing what the emissions are of individual pages. Potentially, that's something that can be thought about. Others, Ecosia, I highlight them as a really great innovation in terms of sustainable tech, because they are the green Google. They plant a tree for every single time you search. When I started using them a couple of years ago, you'd do a search and you'd be like, oh, I can't really find what I'm looking for. But because of the way that search engines work, the more it's used, the better it gets. And now I use Ecosia for everything, and it's just as good as Google. So it's about doing the same thing, but in a better way for the planet. And finally, the Green Web Foundation, which is a plugin. They are working towards a fossil-free internet, and they are a plugin that you can add to your browser, and it has this little face that tells you whether a site is green hosted or not, which is really cool. Again, as a user, you start to see your choices have an impact. So that's really, really great. And finally, there's a bunch of other organizations that are working towards creating more green tech solutions. The Green Software Foundation is one of them. They've built various tools to support companies to calculate carbon emissions, etc. So there's a bunch of different innovations going on. It's still a very new field of sustainability and calculating emissions, but it is really exciting in terms of where we're moving to. And I think we're at a point where we still need to raise a lot of awareness. But making these changes also hold a lot of value for us as a business in terms of making us unique to our customers and stand out to against our competitors as well, while being good for the planet and having that great purpose as well.
The environment benefits from digitization, but as we use technology to digitize products and activities, let's take advantage of the chance to start building infrastructure with carefully considered carbon emissions footprints. This way, we can ensure that our technology is sustainable and that its effect on the environment are not overlooked. Now, let's listen to Attorney Reverie Sapaen, Director of the National Economic and Development Authority, as she discusses how the Philippines integrated the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations into its economic agenda in order to safeguard future generations.
So as you're aware, the Philippines is one of the 192 countries that actually adopted the 2030 agenda. And and at the heart of the 20 agenda are the SDGs, and it's actually a call to action for all member countries. And there are two twin principles where that will summarize the 2030 agenda and the SDGs. And these are the principles of leave no one behind, and the second principle is sustainable development. So when we speak about leave no one behind, so this is actually revolutionary in the sense that we're actually trying to put the furthest behind in our society at the forefront of our consideration. So we're trying to make them our priority. And when we talk about sustainable development, it's ensuring that as we move towards our economic goals, we do that not at the expense of the future generations, but we are trying to ensure that the generations to come will still be able to enjoy the fruits of development, and we leave behind an earth, an environment that is still conducive for the growth, their development, and their progress. So yeah, as you mentioned earlier, the NEDA is the agency assigned to coordinate and oversee the implementation of the SDGs in the country. And this was by virtue of Social Development Committee Resolution number 2. And I'm not very sure if you're aware of the structure, the governance structure of the Social Development Committee. It is actually a committee that is under the NEDA board. And the NEDA board is chaired by the president. And the NEDA board has different committees to actually help provide policy recommendations to the president. So the Social Development Committee is one of them, and it was by virtue of a resolution of this committee that the subcommittee on the Sustainable Development Goals was created. And NEDA was identified to be the lead agency, to be the coordinating agency to oversee the implementation of the SDGs. Our first role as NEDA, which you can say that it is our major deliverable, which is policy formulation. And when we speak about policy formulation, NEDA ensures that we integrate the SDGs, the principles of the 2030 agenda, into our policies, into our plans and our programs. So we want to ensure that our priorities, our plans also align with the SDG goals. And for example, we can say when we look at the Philippine Development Plan, which is one of the formulation of which is one of NEDA's main deliverables. If you peruse the PDP 2023 to 2028, you will see that the SDGs have already been mainstreamed into our plan. This is our national plan. No? So the Philippine Development Plan is our socio-economic blueprint. That's the socio-economic blueprint of the country that sets our priorities and our strategies for the next, for the whole of this administration. So as you will see, if you go over the PDP, we have already mainstreamed the different SDG goals. So that's number one when we speak about policy formulation as one of NEDA's main functions. And as you know, NEDA is also a coordinating agency for SDG implementation. So pursuant to SDC resolution number 2, we have the subcommittee, and then under the subcommittees, we have different technical working groups. Actually, the subcommittee is an interagency committee. And under it, we have different technical working groups. We have one on economic, that's the economic TWG. We have the environment, we have social, and the peace, security, and governance TWG. So there are 4. Because if you also look at the 2030 agenda, there are different, it covers different sectors, the SDG goals. So there are social goals, there's economic, peace, security, and governance, and the environment. So we also try to mirror that in our own technical working groups. No? So each group will look into the SDGs that pertain to them. So we coordinate these different government agencies so that government can have a cohesive plan and strategies in carrying out the SDGs in the country. And also as part of our coordinating function, we also brought into the fold, no? We institutionalized what we call the stakeholders chamber. So this is on the other hand, we have the interagency committees. These are all government agencies. And also we have the stakeholders chamber. So this is part also of our efforts to bring in the private sector, the CSOs, the NGOs to be our partners in implementing the SDGs, because we realize that government cannot do it alone. With only barely 6 years to go, it's already 2024, but that's why it's 2030. So until the 2030 mark, we have barely 6 years. So we really also need the private sector, the NGOs, and the CSOs on board. And we have created also what we call the stakeholders chamber on the SDGs, which is composed of these groups. So we have made them our partners in SDG implementation. And of course, another function of the NEDA, so that's how we relate, how we will continue to implement the SDGs now. What is very important is we also monitor and evaluate. So monitoring is also a very important function of NEDA. So if you peruse the PDP, there are indicators there on the SDGs, and we continuously monitor our progress on the SDGs, whether we are meeting the accomplishment of our targets. Although, well, NEDA also monitors this, but the agency that actually gathers the information is the Philippine Statistics Authority. So that's the PSA. So we work closely with PSA in monitoring the data on the SDGs. And should you have time later on, you can actually go to the PSA website to get all the information you need on the status or the progress of the SDGs in the country. But just very briefly, I can say that we are only 16.7% on track in meeting our SDG targets. And out of the SDG goals, we are on track on the following. So let's look at that. We have SDG Goal 12, which is on sustainable consumption and production. SDG 15, which is life on land. And SDG 17 on partnerships for the goals. Meanwhile, we need acceleration on the following goals. These are SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 4 on quality education, SDG 3 on good health and well-being, SDG 6 on clean water and sanitation, SDG 14, life below water, and 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. We are unfortunately regressing on 8 indicators. These are SDG 2, that's zero hunger, SDG 5, gender equality, 7 on affordable and clean energy, 8 on decent work and economic growth, SDG 9 on industry, innovation, and infrastructure, SDG 10 on reduced inequalities, 11 on sustainable cities and communities, and climate action. So we know the challenges that are before us, no? So that is why one of our responses was to create the stakeholders chamber to ensure that we have the private sector and the CSOs on board. Furthermore, as part of our efforts, because we know that if we look also across the country, development is also unequal, even in the regions. So one of our efforts is also to ensure that we localize the SDGs. So we're also bringing it down to the regions. And one of the things that we've done, it's still ongoing, is what we call the formulation of the regional SDG catch-up plans. So our works, we have already started working on this last year. We have formulated the SDG catch-up plans in our pilot regions. These are regions 12, 8, and 3. And the other regions are still in the process of formulating their own regional SDG catch-up plans. One of the ways also is, of course, you cannot implement this without also moving resources. So we want to ensure that there is efficient resource mobilization. And I think it was about 2 years ago, or 3, there was a law that was passed that provided that 20% of sin taxes on tobacco, heated tobacco, vape products will be allocated for SDG implementation. So pursuant to that law, we have already formulated what we call the program convergence budgeting framework. So through that, we want to ensure that the use of the 20% of the sin taxes will be more focused and will address the SDGs where the country is lagging behind. So we want to ensure that we will be able to really move the SDGs where we are lagging behind and make some improvement.
According to NEDA Undersecretary Rosemary Edilon, the 2030 Agenda has proven to be invaluable in cultivating a deep understanding of the interlinkages among economic, social, and environmental outcomes. We have gone to great lengths to incorporate the SDGs in our Philippine Development Plan. while reshaping our objective from recovery to steering the economy towards a high growth, inclusive, and resilient trajectory. End quote. While the country's progress towards the SDGs remains slow in its first year of the PDP, the subnational catch-up plans hopefully accelerate local initiatives on regressing SDGs indicators. And now, as we bring our vlog series to an end, may this serve as inspiration to us as stewards of the environment to support the agenda in the pursuit of a better life where no one is left behind.